We're going to begin in just a couple of minutes, everybody, so fill your plates and fill your cups. And we'll start exactly at 12:30 to time ourselves to C-SPAN 1. We're going to be live on C-SPAN 1 today. Not 2 or 3, mind you. The other day we had a European official. We were on C-SPAN 3. You guys. Are you going to be able to put this up on the screen for the first speaker? Because it's here but not there.
It'll go up there.
You'll do that?
Yep.
All right, great. Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and to the latest in our Stein program on counterterrorism and intelligence, counterterrorism lecture series. It's my pleasure to have on the podium today Boaz Ganor from Israel, Bruce Hoffman from Georgetown University, Marlene Mazel on leave from Israel, an adjunct scholar here at the Washington Institute. And I am Matthew Levitt. I direct the counterterrorism program here at the Washington Institute. Thank you so much for coming, those of you who are here in person, and for joining us, those of you who are watching us in C-SPAN land. Terrorist acts conducted by individuals acting on their own, inspired by others, completely alone, not so much alone. It's not a new phenomenon. But in the past few years, we've seen an alarming increase in the number of what some have described as lone wolves, lone actors, lone offenders. The Islamic State certainly has been very proactive in using its global social media presence in particular, to constrict individuals, some who have personal problems, others who are inspired by belonging to a higher cause, to carry out attacks in its name, especially if they're unable to come and join the Islamic State in its so-called caliphate. When that existed, it is now falling apart in Iraq and Syria. But meanwhile, in other parts of the world, and in Israel in particular, we're seeing a sharp rise as well in individuals taking it upon themselves to carry out acts of violence without having been recruited by or trained by or armed or funded by an actual group. And so the question for today's session is whether this is a looming threat or a passing fad. And so I'm very pleased to have three good friends on our panel today. Dr. Boaz Ganor is the dean at the ICT Counterterrorism Center, the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Interdisciplinary Center University in Herzliya, Israel. Bruce Hoffman is the director of both the Center for Security Studies and Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. And Marlene Mazel is an adjunct scholar here at the Washington Institute on leave from her position as Director of Counterterrorism Litigation Division at the Israeli Ministry of Justice. Marlene is a good friend. I sit on the board for Boaz's Counterterrorism Institute in Israel, and I teach in, starting this coming semester, in Bruce's program at Georgetown. So this really is a lot of fun for me. And as it happens, they happen to have a lot of expertise on the subject matter. So with no further ado, we'll start with Boaz. We'll go to Bruce, then Marlene. I'll back cleanup. And then I will moderate from the table Q&A sessions until we end at 2 o'clock. Boaz Ganor, please. And I will just lead by example. Please do shut off or silence your phones. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here at the Washington Institute and in this distinguished panel with you. I have to say that Matt gave me and the rest of the panel only 10 minutes. It takes me more to start my engines, but I will do the impossible and try to squeeze my thoughts into a 10 minutes session. I would like to open with trying to allocate where is the phenomenon of the lone wolf stand among the overall different types of terrorist attacks altogether. So let me start by classification, and I will start by classifying different perpetrators of terrorism. And the first type is the one that we're discussing about today. I call this the personal initiative attack. It's more known under the title of the lone wolf attacker. Now, who's the lone wolf? The lone wolf is an individual that have been radicalized by this or the other source. And one day, after being radicalized, he decided he wants to do something about it. He has two options. One option is actually to join a terrorist organization, maybe even to fly as a foreign fighter to Syria or to Iraq. And the other option is to become a homegrown terrorist and to conduct a terrorist attack in the territory that he's living in. This is the lone wolf attacker. The lone wolf attacker is being inspired by a terrorist organization. Many scholars today question the fact that he's a lone wolf altogether, because almost always, there is some connection to a terrorist organization, at least inspiration, which is being done by a terrorist organization. And I would say that still I would use the term a lone wolf because the lone wolf being inspired by a terrorist organization doesn't have any operational ties with the terrorist organization. Meaning the terrorist organization is not necessarily involved in the initiation, in the planning, in the preparation, and the execution of the attack altogether. The second type of perpetrators is what I call the independent network. The independent network practically is a bunch of lone wolves, a group of lone wolves. Now this group, usually a very small group, 2, 3, 4, 5 people all together. Usually we are talking about peers or friends, or in some cases family members. I took the example of the San Bernardino husband and a wife. This is an independent network. Why it a group of lone wolves? Because again, it's an inspiration attack, and not without involvement of operational involvement of a terrorist organization. They are being inspired by the way, if you would ask them before or after the attack, they would refer to themselves as activists of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whoever. And after the attack, most probably the terrorist organization will take responsibility for what they do, but still they are lone wolf or lone network because they do not have any operational ties with the terrorist organization, only being inspired. The third type of terrorist attacks is what I refer as organized terrorism, either sleeper cells or infiltrated cells. Here, this is a different ballgame altogether. Here we are talking about a group, a cell, could be, by the way, even an individual in some cases, that have been recruited to a terrorist organization, trained, and the terrorist organization is involved in all of the operational background and activities that launch at the end of the day this attack. I have good news and bad news when I compare the lone wolf attack to the organized terrorism. The good news is that usually lone wolf attacks are not that lethal. The number of casualties is quite limited. Of course, there are exceptions. Nice, for example, was an exception. But in most cases, how many people can be hurt with a lone wolf attack? Most of the attacks of the lone wolf, the majority of the attacks are using cold weapon. It's either a knife or an axe or rundown or whatever. Some cases they are using light weapon. Very seldom they use explosive device. But when we're talking about this phenomenon, it's limited. The number of casualties are quite limited altogether. When we compare that to the organized terrorism, the organized cells conducted recently Bataclan attack in Paris, the attack in Zaventem, the airport of Belgium, or the airport of Istanbul, 9/11 is organized terrorism. Those are mass casualties attacks altogether. So that's the good news in reference to the lone wolf. The bad news, and I'm using past terms here, I'll explain in a minute why, we used to believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with this phenomenon of lone wolf. Why? Because intelligence, traditional intelligence, human and comment, human sources intelligence and communication intelligence, is based on what? Is based on the fact that there is some kind of a discourse between at least two people that share a secret, the secret of what they're planning to attack. Either you have an agent who's telling you that, or you have the ability to wiretap and to listen to their conversation. But there is a need for a conversation. In the lone wolf, in most cases of the lone wolf, there is no conversation. Everything starts and ends with the sick mind of one person. So intelligence seems to be useless in this regard. I emphasize seems to be. Today we think differently in this regard. Now, going back to another classification, the classification of the terrorist attacks. I would suggest, I don't have enough time to drill into it, but I would suggest to have two scales in our mind when we are trying to classify different types of terrorist attacks altogether. One scale has to do with the level of involvement of the terrorist organization in the attack, starting with no involvement whatsoever, ending with full organized terrorist attack by a terrorist organization. The other scale would be the level of independence of the attacker, meaning is he really independent, or did he share a secret with his friends or other peers? Did he consult with anybody? Did he had any accomplices that gave him passive support or active support? Does he conduct the attack with others, like an independent network, and so on and so forth? Once we have those two scales, we can go back to the classification that we had before and see how lone wolves, local initiative attacks, and organized terrorism fall into that scale. And then we can judge which attack, what type of attack was conducted at that time. Why it's important, it's not just theoretical discussion. It's important because, of course, you need to behave differently. You need to have different operational counterterrorism activities in reference to lone wolves, local network, and organized terrorism altogether. Now let's zoom in on the subject matter of the lone wolf. When we're talking about the lone wolf attack, usually they conduct cold weapon attacks, sabotage, stoning, Molotov cocktail, stabbing, running down. In Israel, we had also bulldozing. It's a running down with a bulldozer. But also, as I said, in some cases, shooting and IED bombings altogether. One exception. Suicide attacks were not conducted by lone wolves. Of course, we need to define the term suicide attack. The way that I describe suicide attack is the type of the person who's strapping himself with a suicide belt or carrying explosive device and pushing the button. Those attacks are always organized terrorism. Always there is an organization behind that who's planning that, who's preparing that, executing that. It could be at the end of the day that there is one individual who conducts the attack, but this is organized terrorism and not lone wolf attack. Now, when we are talking about the rationale behind it, the best news I can give you today, that based on my experience on counterterrorism, I'm in this field more than 35 years, and I can tell you that based on my experience, and I'm generalizing here, terrorists are rational actors. Now, what does this mean? It means that terrorists in general are calculating costs and benefits and choosing the alternative which they believe is more beneficial than costly. That's what rational people do. That's what you do every day. That's what I do every day. That's what the terrorists are doing. But they have a different cost-benefit calculation than we have in the Western society and in other places. So they have their subjective calculus of cost and benefits. A good counterterrorism expert needs to understand, need to take out his own considerations, his own cost-benefit calculation, and put on his head the counterpart, the enemy calculation, cost-benefit calculation. And the bad news is that practically there is no one generic terrorist calculation. The cost-benefit calculation of ISIS is different than Al-Qaeda, is different than Hamas, is different than Hezbollah. And actually, even within the organization, you could see that the considerations of ISIS today are different than the consideration that they used to have a year ago, or probably will be different again in 1 year time. The real bad news that I have is that when we are talking about lone wolves, it's much more difficult to understand the rationale because it's a rationale of an individual and not of a group or an ideological concept. I want to show you 4 pictures that have been taken in Israel in which the common denominator are 4 lone wolves that have just been arrested after stabbing people in the streets in Jerusalem, in other places altogether. They are being handcuffed and being escorted to the police car. Probably they are going to spend life in jail time. That's the common denominator. But there is another common denominator, and you would see it immediately in the pictures. The other common denominator is the smile on the face. This is not a coincidence. I've just visited Chinatown yesterday in New York, and there was an arrest in front of my face. The NYPD arrested the criminal there. He didn't smile. He was walking to the police car, handcuffed. He didn't smile, but they're smiling. And they're smiling because I would argue this is a reflection of their calculus of cost-benefit. What they believe is that what they did right now, although they're going to pay a high price, they will spend life in prison probably, but they did the honorable thing to do. They did something which is more beneficial than costly from their point of view. This is our task, the counterterrorism experts, to crack down the smile, to understand this calculus, and then maybe to have counter-narrative, counter-messages, and so on and so forth. By the way, I use the term jihadi zombies in order to explain this concept. Why? Just because 2 reasons. The first reason, youngsters understand what zombies are. And second, the term zombies doesn't have any shred of honor. And I want to take this concept of the honorable thing to do from them. You would see in the other example, another zombie, jihadi zombie, next to my campus in Israel, actually stabbing every person that is waiting in a public bus stop altogether. That's jihadi zombie. But it's not just Israel. This is a jihadi zombie that was conducted an attack in London, killing Lee Rigby in the suburbs of London, and not running away, actually covering his hands with the blood of the victims and preaching to every person who's ready to take a video clip about his reasons behind it and so on and so forth. Also United States. This is the case of Zale Thompson in 2014, that Afro-American that converted to Islam and went to wage jihad against NYPD officers. By the way, in a nutshell, one new phenomenon that we see is a growing threat of lone wolves, actually radicalized Islamist terrorists, which are converts. The guy from Manchester was a convert. We had other cases of converts, including in Israel, by the way, Jews that converted to Islam. It's probably very much easier to radicalize a person who becoming a newcomer in this religion. Last but not least, and I would limit myself, I said at the beginning that we used to believe that intelligence is useless in reference to dealing with lone wolf attackers because the secret kept in their mind. Well, we were wrong. Instead of human sources and communication sources intelligence, we have found that we have the ability to understand what's going, maybe even to predict what's going to happen based on OSINT. Open sources intelligence, the writing is on the wall of the Facebook, of Telegram, of Instagram, you name it. And what we see that many of those activists actually give a prior warning because they want to brag about it, because they do the honorable thing to do, and they want that the people will believe that what they did, it's the honorable thing to do, and therefore they are sharing that over the social networks. This is one example of a lone wolf in Israel who's saying, in the name of Allah, the merciful and compassionate, oh Allah, today I decided to achieve shuhada, I decided to become a martyr. That's a warning in this regard, and of course tutorials are being conducted. The attack in Berlin is an outcome of the understanding of the attacker. The lesson learned from the attack that occurred before the rundown in Nice, after ISIS actually published exactly what should be done if you want really to conduct an effective rundown activity. After the attack, they are becoming a model of imitations. And what we see practically is a very vicious cycle, and I will conclude with that, starting with the incitement coming from the terrorist organization, moving on or being processed as in a radicalization process with the individual. Then he decides to do something about it. He's planning the attack. Before conducting the attack, in many cases, he justified it, published a political platform. And then after the attack, he became a model of imitation, which is a fertilizer for further incitement. And at the end of the day, this is becoming an epidemic phenomenon. The good news, I want to end with the good news, is that it's transparent, and practically counter-terrorists can watch that, understand that, analyze that, and maybe even prevent it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt, and the Washington Institute for the very kind invitation to come speak today, and especially to serve on this very distinguished panel. Let me focus my remarks a bit more and talk about ISIS or the Islamic State or ISIL, and start with a very broad observation that I think Boaz would agree with me, and I see many people in the audience who I've known for many decades in the counterterrorism world, and I dare say that they would as well. But at the risk of stating the obvious, I think one of the pathologies of both the study of terrorism and counterterrorism is a collective amnesia, or almost a very short memory. I mean, this isn't that surprising. It's the tyranny of the inbox, the daily deluge of threats that one has to contend with. But one of the problems or challenges is that it often crowds out any historical perspective. So in that respect, let me read you a quote and think about who would have said this and when would it have been said. Tracking down Americans and the Jews is not impossible. Killing them with a single bullet, a stab, or a device made up of a popular mix of explosives, or hitting them with an iron rod is not impossible. Burning down their property with Molotov cocktails is not difficult. With the available means, small groups could prove to be a frightening horror for the Americans and the Jews. Any takers? Anybody want to guess? Ayman al-Zawahiri in Nights Under the Prophet's Banner, released in December 2001. So even as then the deputy leader of al-Qaeda, today the current leader of al-Qaeda, was on the run from perhaps the greatest onslaught ever directed against a terrorist group in history, Operation Enduring Freedom, nonetheless had time to write this, this statement that was designed to resurrect al-Qaeda and carry on the struggle. Now, the only problem is that it completely fell on deaf ears. The phenomenon of lone wolf terrorism did not materialize until over a decade later with the rise of ISIS. And then we have the statement of Mohammed Al-Adnani from September 2014, the late deputy commander or senior official, operational planner, propagandist par excellence of ISIS. And his words were almost remarkably similar to Zawahiri's. If you are not able to find an IED or a bullet, then single out the disbelieving American, Frenchman, or any of their allies. Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over in your car, or throw him down from a high place, or choke him, or poison him. It's precisely ISIS's innovative, revolutionary use of social media that has transformed both the nature of terrorism in a remarkably short span of time, but also empowered this group in less than 3 years to have become one of the most challenging threats we faced and one of the most, I would argue, as we'll see, durable terrorist organizations. You don't have that ability to be revolutionary and innovative and then fade from the scene because of the loss of a couple of cities. So one way or the other, I would argue, ISIS is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. And one of the main reasons for that has been their ability to harness and exploit social media and to summon this broad universe of lone wolves in addition to the more professional terrorists. There's another point, I think, where ISIS, unfortunately, has been enormously innovative, which will have more immediate consequences for us in years to come. The 9/11 model of terrorism, the attacks from September 11th, 2001, involved professional terrorists trained overseas, deployed against their target, operating under a very clear hierarchy, command and control structure with very strict operational orders. So that was the traditional model of terrorism. Of course, the lone wolf model that Boaz has just so brilliantly described challenges law enforcement and authorities in a completely different way. Lone wolves have no tails, as it were. There's no logistical tail to interdict. They're much more harder to predict. Fortunately, as Boaz pointed out, their violence is more limited, but nonetheless, their ability to overwhelm, preoccupy, and distract law enforcement and intelligence and security services is enormous. And yet, what we see is that the most formidable terrorist organizations are also the ones that are most innovative and most dynamic, unfortunately, like ISIS. Because ISIS has now, in recent months, pioneered yet a third variant that goes from the traditional, very top-down form of terrorism, the 9/11 model, let's say, to the bottom-up form of terrorism, the lone wolf. Now they have the hybrid, which will, I would argue, present new and very serious challenges to law enforcement and intelligence. This is the new hybrid of enablers that take advantage of lone wolves, of individuals that have no prior connection to a terrorist organization, that may never have met a terrorist in their life, may never have left even their own community to go be trained overseas or anywhere else in terrorism, but nonetheless, as we've seen in recent years, who are manipulated, exploited, ultimately inspired and animated to commit acts of violence in support of or on behalf of a terrorist organization's aims. The new twist now is that these terrorist organizations are providing these individuals with very specific, often very detailed intelligence and targeting instructions, thus empowering them, thus making the lone wolf even more of a threat than they've been to date. This new emergence of a different challenge was brought home to me, at least, last March, when ISIS released a hit list, or a targeting list of some 8,000 names of Americans from around the country. When I attempted to print it out, admittedly it wasn't formatted terribly well, but nonetheless it ran to about 425 pages. It had the names of individuals, both their work and home addresses. People who live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area will recognize some of the addresses of the suburban facilities of U.S. intelligence agencies. Email addresses, sometimes mobile phone numbers. But in other words, this was a hit list or a target list that ISIS at least meant, firstly, to sow a certain amount of psychological discord, create alarm and anxiety, which is always the goal of terrorism, but also further encourage and, in essence, plus up, enhance the power of the lone wolves. So consequently, ISIS has changed the nature of terrorism in a very short span of time, which I think means that it's not going to disappear or fade from the scene anytime soon. The fundamental challenges facing law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and security services today, not just in the United States, but I would argue around the world, is not to be overwhelmed by the threat of lone wolves, not to be deluded into focusing exclusively on any one threat, not to be distracted by the low-hanging fruit of comparatively unprofessional lone wolves, but to also pay serious attention to the entire spectrum of terrorist threats, including those coming from more professional, better organized, planned, the traditional form of terrorism, in other words. This may sound like a truism, of course, but I would argue this was precisely the trap that the French fell into in 2015. The intense focus on lone wolves that was imposed on French authorities by just the proliferation of the number of individuals whom they had to track, whom they had to monitor, and the degradation to their abilities because of the focus on one particular segment of the threat led perhaps tragically to a lowering of the guard and to the successful simultaneous suicide attacks that we saw. So in conclusion, therefore, at a time of comparatively diminishing resources, at a time after a decade and a half plus of the war on terrorism, when political will has been reduced, when our collective governments and countries are sapped by this ongoing war, what we see is a multiplication of new and even more challenging threats that means we can never let down our guard. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today, Matt and Boaz and Bruce. I'm speaking today as Matt mentioned. I work in the Ministry of Justice, and I have the privilege of being on academic leave this summer. So I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. And what I'm going to be looking at is one little small slice of this discussion that we were having about lone wolves and stabbing attacks in Israel committed by youth. So recently, the EU came out with a terrorism trend report, and it identified a recent trend. It came up with 14 trends. And trend number 10 is that youth are playing an increasingly independent operational role in committing terrorist attacks in EU countries. So my contribution to today's panel is to preview some very preliminary research that I started to work on in Israel, and I'm continuing here in the Institute. And I said it's a very small issue. What I was interested in studying was, did the PA and Fatah leadership take acts to glorify the terrorist acts of specific youth? And if they did that play a role in encouraging further youth to engage in further violence? So in Israel, this issue came up in October of 2015. In 2015, October alone, there were 59 terrorist attacks. 17 of those terrorist attacks were committed by youth, nearly a third. And in October, I recall living in Israel, there was a raging debate that erupted in the media. What was causing this new wave of violent terror attacks by youth? Or in general, but in particular by youth, was very troubling. Some were of the view that it was a statement of Mahmoud Abbas, chairman of the PA, that he made in an interview on Palestinian television on September 16th. And I quote, he said, "We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. This is pure blood, clean blood, blood on its way to Allah. With the help of Allah, every shaheed will reach paradise, and every wounded will be rewarded by Allah." His words were widely disseminated in the media, and some credited these words for inspiring the violent stabbing attacks that began 2 weeks later in October. Others took a different view. They said, no, these terrorists, including the youth, they were lone wolves. They were angry at the occupation. They were frustrated after peace talks broke down. One Palestinian poll that was taken in September 2015 said that 57% of those polled supported the return to an armed intifada. And other experts opined that it was really a complex combination of both of these factors. So what I was looking at, what kind of sparked my interest, was what was actually happening on the ground. How many youth were committing attacks? And I started to study the specific attacks committed. And what you can see here that we found a very troubling number. There are 105 attacks that were committed by youth, their ages between 11 to 17. And then when we quantified attacks, we quantified violent attacks. I'll get into that in a minute. We took out information on rocks and Molotov cocktails because we were trying to really study this specific new phenomenon of stabbings with knives. So then there was a question I was looking at, well, what's the percentage? What's the percentage of the 105 of the overall attacks committed during the time period? And the statistics thus far that I found is that between a quarter and a half of all the attacks that were committed at the time. So clearly, there was a dramatic increase in the stabbing attacks of youth. And the research that I've been conducting has tried to answer 3 different questions. Number one, why? Why? Why were these Palestinian youth engaging in violent stabbing and terror attacks? Number 2, is there a connection between actions of the PA-Fatah leadership glorifying the specific acts of the youth and encouraging further attacks? And 3, if we find that a correlation does exist, are there lessons that can be learned about the radicalization and incitement? So the data that we found thus far is that we found that there were 4 11 and 12-year-olds, 5 13-year-olds, 59 14 through 16-year-olds, and 29 17-year-olds. And you can see on the right pie chart, the vast majority of the attacks were stabbing attacks using knives. So the next question we were looking at was really very specific. We were looking at specific glorification of the acts of the youth by the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. So what we did, we're looking for public source information, because the information had to reach the youth. We looked at Arabic, English, Hebrew websites, all different types of information, TV, different aspects, to identify whether the PA and Fatah were taking actions to glorify the specific youth. Now what we did, simple, we took the names of all the youth, we ran it through all these databases to see if we could find acts of glorification. Now let me just be clear, because it's a very specific study, of things that we didn't include. In the study, which I think I might continue to include or look at over the summer, we did not include examples of general glorification. For example, there was a report that was issued by Palestinian Media Watch on PA education that was issued during this year in July 2015. They found that educational institutions were teaching hate and praising terrorists, including youth who kill civilians and depict them as heroes and martyrs, which might have a different kind of, as Boaz was saying, that might have a different influence on their thinking as to evaluation of what's important. The other thing that we didn't include were general statements of praise of youth. So if there were general statements by the PA and Fatah praising the actions of youth in general, those are not reflected in the data thus far. We just reflected specific actions on specific youth that committed the terrorist attacks. And at the same time, just to be clear, to give a fuller picture of what was going on, there were statements made by the PA and Fatah that repudiated terrorism. The study, though, wanted to focus on whether the actions were consistent with these statements. There was also, during this time period, significant security cooperation between the PA and Israel, which was very, very important and very helpful in thwarting terrorist attacks, including terrorist attacks by youth. And at the same time, as Boaz was discussing and Bruce, there were many other factors of information that was released and that was available to the youth that were exposed to information by Hamas, by ISIL. There were social media accounts that were opened at the time. One was called Stab. Another one was called Slaughter the Jews. There were many different accounts, and it's quite horrifying when you see them, of little toddlers holding knives. And there were also instructional videos that were issued by terrorist organizations about how to kill a Jew using a knife. So there were many aspects of information that could be influencing youth that are part of many other studies. We were looking at the very specific question of whether there were acts of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah leadership on specific acts of the children. So this is what we found. There were in fact acts of glorification by the PA. We found over 25 specific acts. What kind of information were we seeing? We were seeing actions such as giving the youth terrorists an official military funeral, publishing flyers, official flyers that condone the youth as a martyr, and paying condolence visits to the families. So here we have 2 examples of what that actually looks like. One, this is a flyer of Al-Adnani Abu Khadim, 17 years old. You can see the official symbols to the left and right of Yisrael Arafat on the right and the symbol of Fatah on the left. And it says here, with pride and honor, the National Liberation Movement of the Palestinian People, Fatah, Central Hebron Branch, Old City, eulogized its brave Shaheed Al-Adnani Abu Shakhadim. And he was responsible for being involved in a stabbing attack that injured a soldier at the Gush Etzion Junction. And here's another example of both of a military funeral of Ala Bar Kosabi. That was one of our cases that we looked at, where he was given a formal military funeral. And on the bottom, you see a flyer of three terrorists at the time. One of them is him. And the third statement on the bottom reflects his name, also being praised through the official channels. So the next question that we were looking at, well, is there a correlation? All right, so we saw that there were specific acts of glorification, which was troubling, because it's not what you would want to see in this context. So then we were looking at, well, was there a correlation? Was there any correlation between the numbers of attacks glorifying the acts of the specific children and the commission of attacks or additional attacks? And the preliminary results were fascinating. So you'll see here on top the acts of glorification, and you can see next the terrorist attacks by youth. And what we can see so far, and I said it's preliminary data, there seems to be a correlation between statements of glorification and the number of terror attacks that were committed. So you can see there were many more attacks committed between October and March, and there seems to be a sharp drop. If you see starting April towards the end to September 2016, a dramatic drop both in the acts of glorification and in the ensuing or in the terrorist attacks that were committed by youth. Now, I'm not really sure what it means at this stage. There could have been many environmental factors that had nothing to do with the glorification and that there isn't a correlation necessarily at all. I mean, we definitely did not find, the data did not, at least the data that I was looking at so far, did not show causation. You couldn't say that there was a specific statement of glorification of the PA and Fatah that caused a specific response by the youth. That would be much more complex, as Boaz was saying, and interviewing and trying to collect much more data from different sources. There was one example in the study of the 105, a 15-year-old Murad Badr Abdullah Das. When she was interviewed, she was murdered Daphne Meir, 38-year-old mother of 6, on January 17th. She explained during her questioning that she was influenced in general by Palestinian television, which had a big influence on him, and that his decision to carry out the attack. So that was, not an example of direct causation, just one individual who felt that they were influenced by what they saw on television. So I started to interview different experts, showing them the chart, saying, what do you think? Is there a correlation? What could be the reason for this dramatic drop? This is what some views that I've heard so far that I thought I would share. Some experts were of the view that it was actually the upcoming report of the Middle East Quartet that was due at the time that was going to address the issue of incitement, and that led to a decrease, understanding that the report would be released. Others were of the view that Palestinian society and individuals in the society were very upset that their youth were engaging in violent attacks, and numerous measures were taken by the PA in various different angles, including to the reduction of glorification, in order to actively discourage youth from these attacks. Some experts who know about Israeli counterterrorism efforts thought that it was the Israeli counterterrorism efforts, some of what Boaz described, different measures that were taken through different types of open source intelligence information in order to identify attacks before they occurred and to prevent them. And people who understand all those three issues, some of them said it was a combination of all of the above. So in any event, it does seem very interesting. It seems interesting in terms of two factors. If you actually could quantify what's the relevant input or influence of one form of glorification or incitement, that might be helpful to counterterrorism study efforts. And as Boaz and Bruce were both discussing, it's also important to look at the cumulative impact on the particular youth of all the different areas of incitement or influence that might be then encouraging youth to act. Also, because perhaps if you could find out what was encouraging them, you could find out how to discourage them, stop the attacks, and that might be equally helpful to the counterterrorism efforts. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. I like to go last so that when all the good stuff is taken, I can come up with a few short nuggets and then open up to Q&A. So we'll do that today. And we'll start with maybe, I guess you'd call it a mea culpa. because there are many of you who've sat in these chairs before and have heard me speak at this podium before, and I'm sure there's at least one or two of you who are really keen to hear what I'm going to say about the nature of lone wolf attacks, given that I've stood here in the past and said that the lone wolf idea is really largely a misnomer. And I think that when I said that at this podium, including once at an event together with Bruce back in November, when I wrote this in two different foreign policy pieces in September of last year and March of last year, I don't think I was wrong. But of course, counterterrorism is not static. And when the Islamic State was still remaining and expanding, to use its own terminology, and then maybe even more so when it was a little bit on its back heels and really sought to actively send returning foreign fighters back home to Europe or elsewhere, to direct and where it couldn't, maybe just enable, as Bruce discussed, terrorist attacks that really would be maybe carried out by a lone individual, maybe a lone attack, maybe a lone offender, but not really a lone wolf, not really someone operating on his, or let's be clear, her own. In fact, the Europol counterterrorism report that Marlene mentioned specifically raises concerns about the increase not only in the number of attacks overall, not only in the number of inspired attacks overall, but in particular about the number of attacks involving women as one of these new trends. And I think we can look back at Mohammed Al-Adnani's speech in September 2014, and then more recently, not long before he was killed in May 2016, very specifically calling on people, if you can't come here, at least do things where you are, as examples of the way in which the Islamic State proactively tried to play on the situations in which at-risk individuals, mostly youth, found themselves, but then to provide people with some type of capability. So at the time, I felt that the era of the lone wolf was largely over because what we were seeing at the time was more known wolves than lone wolves, people who were on the radar of law enforcement in one way or another. They weren't completely unknown, and they were having some type of connective tissue to an organized group, even if they weren't originally recruited by that group or armed by that group. Maybe the only way you could really draw the line is through kind of further radicalization and maybe, in some cases, the provision of some intelligence to be able to carry out the attack. But what we're seeing now, at a time when the caliphate is not just on its back heels, but is about to be destroyed, is something a little different. And we're seeing a desire on the part of the Islamic State to be able to perpetuate itself as an idea beyond the existence of its caliphate as a state as such. We're also seeing several other phenomena. On the one hand, the caliphate is about to end as such, but the caliphate genie is out of the bottle. And for those people, wherever they are in the West, let's say, who have grievances and who are reading the online propaganda, their memory, as I think it was Bruce who said, their memory will be short-lived. And one of the radicalization messages that we're sure to start seeing, if it's not out there already, is there was a caliphate. It wasn't perfect. We made mistakes, but there was a caliphate, and all we really wanted to do was to be left alone, to live Sharia-compliant lives, but no, the West wouldn't have that, and therefore it was destroyed. If only we had been allowed to progress, we would have become less brutal, we would have become more normal. In other words, the idea that there was recently a caliphate, not hundreds or thousands of years ago, but recently a caliphate that did exist, whether or not the fact that it was rejected by the vast majority of Muslims who did not see this as a caliphate nor Baghdadi as a caliph is going to be irrelevant to some of these individuals who will be drawn to this message. And they'll be drawn to this message through a medium that still exists. Social media is able to penetrate every border into the basement of every home, and people who have problems are still going to be drawn to these issues. And I would argue that the grievances that have led people to be attracted to and to have the cognitive opening for radical messages is, in fact, if anything, on the rise. Europeans have let in many refugees, many migrants, but they haven't done a particularly good job of enabling them to acculturate into society. There are a lot of different ways in which this is a set of grievances that's likely to expand. And so if you look just at the past few months, you can see groups trying to kind of rebuild a new kind of propaganda specifically about the lone wolves. I should stress that, as Bruce noted, the idea is not new. When Ayman al-Zawahiri, as the deputy chief of al-Qaeda, raised it, no one was listening at the time. But over time, people did start to listen. You might recall the online ebook published in 2015, How to Survive in the West, a Mujahid Guide. You may recall that Rahimi, the bomber in New York and New Jersey, appears to have been inspired not by the Islamic State, but by Anwar al-Awlaki, who has proven to be at least as magnetic a radicalizer in death as he was in life. But let's just look over the past few months. Just this month, an Islamic State ebook was released to homeschool lone wolves, as they put it. The Lone Wolf Handbook, written in Turkish, disseminated on Telegram. In June, a Nashir related to the Islamic State, Al-Batar, distributed a video noting attacks in Melbourne, etc., and specifically calling for attacks in Australia, America, Canada, Europe, and Russia. And, of course, there was the Rumiyah, the 9th volume of Rumiyah, released in May with this large section called Just Terror Tactics on Hostage Taking, with details on sections on hostage taking, on how to carry out acts of violence armed with a firearm, how to acquire firearms, what might be the ideal types of targets for these attacks, how to execute people, what to do if you don't have a firearm, etc., how to lure a target. For example, post in an online site that you have an apartment to rent, lure people to the apartment, and then kill them, something that Israeli security has had to deal with over the years, etc. And I should note that much like the case of Rahimi, who was radicalized by Anwar al-Awlaki, we need to be aware that this same phenomenon, it might not have caught on and had momentum when Zawahiri claimed it shortly after 9/11, but it certainly is now. There is a competition between the remains of the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, which is causing al-Qaeda to try and pick up its game. Al-Qaeda is very much, I believe, on the rise. The Washington Institute just led a research and produced a volume edited by my colleague Aaron Zellin on how al-Qaeda has survived the rise of the Islamic State, the Arab Springs, etc. And al-Qaeda also has now begun to reintroduce the magazine Inspire, a shorter version called Inspire Guide, very specifically on people who succeeded in carrying out attacks, including lone offender attacks, and how you can do the same. And I think we need to, as Bruce said, not be so caught up in one part of the threat that we don't see the others. The al-Qaeda threat is very, very serious. And then I think it's important to look at the recent Europol report, which talked about that spectrum of inspired, enabled, and directed plots. And when it comes to those who are inspired and are lone offenders, they write that these are individual attackers, possibly but not necessarily being helped by family and or friends as accomplices. They're inspired by jihadist propaganda messaging, but not necessarily receiving personal direction or instruction from any group. And that should echo what you heard just now from Boaz. And I think we need to recognize that even as we have success in the battlefield against the Islamic State, the radicalization process is not linear. You can have someone who is radicalized and maybe gets de-radicalized, or maybe it's better way to put it is disengages from radicalism, but then events can happen and that person can be radicalized again. And when you have social media available 24/7, messages can change, messages can be updated, people can be radicalized again. I'm of the opinion that so long as our strategy in Syria, our counterterrorism strategy in Syria, is all and only about the Islamic State, and we're not paying particular attention to al-Qaeda, say in Idlib. We're not paying almost any attention to a guy whose name maybe some have forgotten, I don't know, named Bashar al-Assad, that the same ideas that caused foreign terrorist fighters in the first place will still be there. There were foreign terrorist fighters going to Syria before there was Nusra, before there was ISIL, and there will still be, even if we dismantle the Islamic State. And I'm drawn to a recent national counterterrorism study on the likelihood that U.S. homegrown violent extremism will experience recidivism. And they mention many cases in the report, and we need to take this to heart. There will be recidivism in terms of the people who return to radicalization, and that means the likelihood of still more individuals acting on their own. I'm still not in love with the term lone wolves. It sort of creates them out to be big and powerful, maybe even honorable, as Boaz said. They're not really wolves at all. If they're truly lone wolves, then they've broken from the pack and they have no connective tissue whatsoever from the group, which I would argue would have to include inspiration, and that definitely exists. But the problem of lone offenders, or as the Europol report puts it, of lone attackers, is very real. And while the Israelis have done some really interesting and effective work in being able to mine social media postings, not everybody is posting on the social media. And even when they are, we're not always able, especially in a country the size of the United States as opposed to Israel, able to mine that data in a timely manner. And the biggest concern, therefore, isn't just the issue of encryption when you get to the inability to follow those messages that still exist between people who are part of a group. The problem is also that people can be radicalized. People are radicalized today so quickly. It's not like, when I started my career in counterterrorism in the FBI in the 1990s, and there was a lead time. The flash to bang, the period of time between radicalization and mobilization can be very, very, very quick, days or even hours. And that doesn't leave law enforcement or intelligence a whole lot of leeway or much of a window to be able to catch on to what could happen very, very quickly. And when you're talking about doing something as simple as picking up a knife or getting in a car, or in this country, let's be honest, it's not difficult to get your hands on a handgun, then we are talking about the very strong likelihood that as we move forward, as the Islamic State continues to crumble, what I said last year will no longer be true, or will not only be true. That is to say, it will still be the case that we will have enabled and even directed plots. In the near term, those directed plots are likely to increase as the Islamic State collapses. Again, the Europol report in particular specifically says that there is data, intelligence, and there is concern about the Islamic State now trying to infiltrate operatives, trained operatives into the West to be able to do things right now as they are collapsing at home. But moving beyond that, or I should say actually in parallel to that, at the same time as that, the likelihood that individuals will try and carry things out on their own, I think, increases. And that means that the nature of the threat will be more than just ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It won't only be organized, it will also be something else. And that's going to be much more difficult for us to tackle, even if, as you've heard, the attacks that they may be successful in carrying out are likely to be much less lethal. But a few people killed or wounded, a bunch of people killed and wounded is horrible. And the terrifying effect, the terroristic effect that it will have on society and on the economy would be significant. Thank you very much. Okay, this leaves us plenty of time for Q&A. So I'll take you in the order that I see you. And we'll start right here in the blue shirt, please. I'm going to ping pong across the room so we get everybody. It's all good.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, retired U.S. Foreign Service. I'd like to follow up on some of the remarks of Marlene Mazel about what happens in Israel. And that's the issue of the possible instauration of payments to families of prisoners or families who were killed. Number one, how much do you think of an inspiration those payments account for? Number two, what is the likelihood that some governments, either in the U.S. or the European Union, as suggested by Prime Minister Netanyahu, ought to somehow make some kind of a linkage between those statements and reduction of support to the Palestinian Authority. And if indeed those types of payments were reduced or cut, what would be the likelihood of the effect of that?
I think it's a good question. It's been very much in the media lately because the PA gave out information with regarding to its budget. So I was looking at the information this week in the context of this study to look at, what proportion of its budget, what was happening in this context. So the numbers are like almost $200,000 of the payments are paid for martyr families, which would be the families of these children, which was a 9% increase from last year. And that they would, I didn't check the data with these names yet. I think it's something that I'd like to do, but that would include paying the families of terrorists, even if the terrorist was an attempted terrorist, that they would get payment if they didn't succeed as part of this plan. Now, just as a parent of children, and what influences children, I think children, want to be able to be relevant. And we're thinking about culturally, could it influence a child if he knows if he commits a terrorist act that his family then gets paid money as a result of his heroic act as a shaheed, that's what he sees, I would imagine that could definitely have a detrimental effect on the child. So I think one of the things that I was looking at in the study is really consistent messaging. As it relates to youth, most parents know children don't do well with mixed messages. So if a government wants to be consistent or if educational institutions want to be consistent, they want to be consistent in the messages they're giving in all different channels. So that means you would hope that the education system will give a message that terrorism is wrong and not say anything that's, lauds terrorists at all. You would not want to see official funerals or praise of somebody that committed a terrorist attack, particularly children, because you want to protect children from being encouraged to do that. And you wouldn't want to see payment going to the families. The usual messages that you would see to children is that this is a criminal act. Criminal acts should be abhorred. People who commit crimes get held to justice, and there's no, positive effect from committing a crime. That would be the kind of messaging that would be consistent with trying to discourage violent terrorist attacks.
Excellent. Right up here in the front, Tricia.
Hi, Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Matt and anyone else who wants to answer this, two things I'd like to ask. First, is there a worry that individual attackers can develop techniques that would lead to larger numbers of casualties? The Nice attack obviously was one way, and one has seen other vehicle attacks that had fairly serious numbers. You could think of drones. You could think of things that an individual could concoct or might read on the internet. So that's one thing I wanted to ask. Well, let me stop there. Yeah.
I won't be able to go to sleep tonight. So, again, the good news is that lone offenders tend not to have great capabilities. For most of the things that are going to lead to larger casualties, you really do need at least a little bit of training. Explosives with chemical precursors. It's not impossible, and it's not like there aren't people out there who have some training capability. But in general, you'll see people who try to make explosives when they are just following directions off the internet as being largely unsuccessful. Not always. Look at the Boston Marathon bombing. There are other things that are possible. Again, I'm concerned that in this country, you can get not just a handgun, but a semi or fully automatic weapon. And if you can see it in a school shooting scenario, you can see it. You could certainly see it in a terrorist scenario. Look at the kind of weaponry that was found in San Bernardino. That could have been much, much worse. Certainly the vehicular attack is something of concern. DHS and others sent out bulletins at the time. There's a lot of attention now being placed to, I guess, again, once again, years after 9/11, to ballards and different ways to protect infrastructure. And then there is now a concern, especially very recently with drones. We've seen the Islamic State weaponize drones in the battlefield. And one of the concerns we have in general is that when somebody sees something succeeding, they think they can do it too. It's true for the lone offender in general. Why might someone be more likely to be mobilized to violence today in certain circumstances than before? Because they've seen that others have done it. and maybe also they've seen that others have done it and been lauded, whether it's by the Islamic State or in the Palestinian context, something else. When people have seen that the Islamic State has been able to weaponize drones in Iraq or in Syria, maybe they think to themselves, I can do that here, and you can use any kind of drone. So there are lots of concerns about these things. The good news is law enforcement is very, very animated on the subject. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Maybe I'm a little bit less optimistic than Matt on that matter. I would say that we need to understand terrorism as a phenomenon, as an evolving phenomenon. It's all the time changing. We cannot lay back and say, okay, what we know is what there is. On the other side, there are terrorists, and the terrorists are all the time looking for new methods, new techniques, different targets, and so on and so forth. It's a cat and mouse chase, and counter-terrorists cannot lay back and say, we are fine with that. Having this in mind, I would, of course, not get into details. I don't want even to induce ideas to the terrorists in general or the lone wolves in particular. But I would say that I believe that this is a growing phenomenon. It's not going to disappear. It's not going to change traditional terrorism. I definitely share with Bruce and Matt the concern with organized terrorism, with big attacks, even the level of 9/11. We should not exclude that. But on top of that, we are having now a growing phenomenon, not a new phenomenon, but a growing phenomenon that will challenge us in different ways all the time. So I do believe and I do hope that there are those people which bear the responsibility to prevent the terrorist attacks as we speak right now, thinking about what would be the next more effective tactic that the terrorists, the lone wolves, might use. Because I have no doubt in my mind that those who incite them, we heard from Marlene about the incitement as a precursor of that activity. Those who incite them, those who teach them, those who give them the guidelines will try to be more effective and more innovative in their thinking in this regard.
Can I add
Yeah,
something?
please.
Yeah.
And then
I want to
we'll
be
go over
more pessimistic than even Boaz. Timothy McVeigh, right? I mean, was it an archetypal lone wolf because it was a conspiracy with Terry Nichols and Michael and Laurie Fortier, but nonetheless, he had no direct organizational connection. He wasn't carrying that out on behalf of an organization. The key variable there was he was able to get the information freely available, which is even 1995 was an infantile era compared to now in the exchange of information. So, you know, I mean, my emphasis is always on the threat from organizations, and maybe not another 9/11, but certainly Mumbai-style or Paris-style attacks is one of the main ones I think the West faces in an organized fashion. But it is worrisome that you have now a mass of people that can access the information far more easily than McVeigh could have. You also have a large number of foreign fighters, 40,000 from 120 countries. Not all of them are going to be killed off, despite some, I think, optimistic hopes they will. Some will come back and be part of an organized campaign, but some may be the lone wolves of tomorrow and may have the same military expertise that McVeigh had. Then I would also say, just as Boaz described, the nature of terrorism is constantly evolving and changing. Unfortunately, never in a good way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a panel like this. And, you know, when I began my professional career as a terrorism analyst in 1981, we worked on a study for the American intelligence community that sort of mapped the attributes of terrorist groups during the 1960s and 70s. And then the two most common vocations were teachers and medical doctors. And teachers was often philosophy professors. So, I mean, you know, those of you who have been in university, even if you're not a philosophy professor, you may have a limited technological capability. But think of what's happening today. More and more engineers and scientists are being drawn into terrorism. And of course, Diego Gambetta and Stefan Hertog's excellent book, Engineers of Jihad, you know, prove that there's an alarmingly high proportion of individuals in Salafi jihadi groups that have engineering backgrounds. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, his nephew, Ramzi Ahmed Youssef. I mean, World Trade Center, 9/11 attacks and the 1993 World Trade Center attacks were both engineers. So this shows that as more engineers come into terrorism, the potential even for lone wolves to be more. And again, I focus on the organizations, but I'm enormously worried that the potential for lone wolves to be more dangerous and more consequential, unfortunately, is growing.
We'll go to Jess Sedek here in the pink wall. The mic is coming. I'll just add that your answer makes me think, by the way, we're focusing largely on Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and Islamist-inspired, but there's a equally important need to pay attention to the rise of terrorism and potential homegrown terrorism from the left wing and right wing, where there tend to be people who do have military expertise of the type that could make things more dangerous. Jeff?
Thanks, Matt. Jeff Sadek. Boaz, thank you very much for the terrific presentation you gave. My question is, you talked about, you praised the internet as a tool for understanding the smile, right? And then from there we can develop counter-narratives and counter-messaging. So as a terrorism researcher, I guess you would support unimpeded access to this content that's online. But have you thought about to what extent you would support taking this material down? And what sort of material would you say that would be okay to do, take down from the internet?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a great question, and maybe I would have. I mean, it's always calculating between the ability to monitor over the internet what they do, what they say, what they plan, and trying to prevent this radicalization process, maybe even communication between them through the internet. You have pros and cons for that, but between you and me, this is a lost war. We cannot prevent them. I mean, even if we would have wanted to, we cannot seal the internet. We cannot seal the misuse of the internet. And if you seal one niche, then they would develop another niche. It's always this effort to work. So I would say that what can be done and should be done is to identify those negative and dangerous messages, and then use two tracks. One is the need to develop new type of big data capability that will monitor all the discourse over the internet, over the social networks. It can be done. It is being done today, but it should be much more sophisticated in order to identify the early stages of the radicalization process, not just with keywords, by the way, but also with sentiments over the internet and so on, so much more developed systems, algorithms for that matter. And there is a need to develop a doctrine how to work with this new data, because it was mentioned, I think, by Matt, that, okay, even if you know that somebody said something over the internet, what do you do with that right now? How do you prevent the attack of tomorrow morning? Here there is no long preparation term. The guy could say something over the internet, grab a knife and run to wage a jihad in his view or something like that. So there is a lot to do here. Can be done, should be done, needed to be done on this respect. The other thing which is needed, and I think we see the beginning of it, is the cooperation of the internet services, those the Facebook, the Google, Telegram, and others that need to be more cooperative. Today they are much more cooperative than they used to be a year or 2 years ago, but they need to be much more cooperative because they bear a lot of responsibility there. And if they would not do it on a voluntary basis, then I wouldn't recommend to have laws against them or something like that, but I would definitely beat them in their pockets. Meaning, if they do not cooperate in preventing and closing those insightful messages, I would encourage the victims of terrorism and their families actually to sue them for not doing that.
Excellent. Right over here, please, on the right.
Bob Winter, a failed academic philosopher.
That's kind of scary.
Yes. You've spoken about the need to monitor the internet to try to identify, and as Boaz just said, in a more sophisticated way, who potential terrorists would be. And there's been a lot of discussion about the need to develop effective countermeasures on the internet, but no one has really elaborated on where that stands. I wonder if any of the members of the panel could tell us where you think we are, not in identifying terrorists using the internet, but in developing in propaganda, counter messaging, whatever terminology you want to use. And is that really a realistic and effective countermeasure in your judgment? Thank you.
I'll just jump in to say that, my co-panelists are absolutely right. This is an area where We didn't have a whole lot of movement, and now suddenly we do. And I would point, there are many examples to point to, but I would point in particular to Google's efforts on Google and YouTube itself to redirect people when they do certain searches to certain counter messaging. And it's not just the decision to redirect, which as a kind of a media or social media platform is a pretty big deal for them to make this determination. But then to what do you redirect them towards? And Google's actually done some pretty cutting edge research recently on what messages work. Sending people to interview people who were captured from ISIS or people who defected from ISIS, sending people to work, to interview people who are working in communities in Europe, et cetera, to see what's working, interviewing mothers, et cetera, and actually doing some pretty very tangible in-the-weeds work and coming up with some pretty effective counter-messaging tools. Now, one of the things they're grappling with right now as we speak is, as you've heard us all say, this is non-static. It's always changing. And so the situation of the Islamic State is changing. How should we anticipate that the message will change? How much of it will be that the caliphate genie is out of the bottle, and it's that if only the West would leave us alone, we could have had a caliphate, and it would have gotten better, trust me. How much of it will be something relating to the poor acculturation of refugees or the relative responsibility of the West for what is going to continue to happen in Syria and maybe even in Iraq or Yemen? We need to think about how that message is changing because, as Boaz said, you can't assume that what happened yesterday or what happens today is what's going to happen tomorrow. In fact, you need to assume it's not. So there's a lot of work being done there on this.
I would add to that the following argument. You were talking about, Bob, you're talking about countermeasures, and practically I would translate it to counter-narrative. What needed to be said in order to counter the narrative of those jihadists over the internet and so on and so forth. And I would say I believe that we are still far from understanding the narrative, that we will be able to develop the counter-narrative. There is a lot to be done in, first of all, understanding the narrative itself. I was hinting in my presentation one way of thinking, and I definitely believe in that. We do some research now in Israel trying to understand that much more and to have some evidence-based information on that. I believe that the concept of the honorable thing to do is the narrative. By the way, it's the flip side of the honorable thing to do is humiliation. If you analyze the propaganda of different terrorist organizations all over the world, the common denominator is Islamist jihadist terrorist organization, starting with Al-Qaeda, moving on to ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Hamas, Hezbollah. You would find in most cases of the messages that they are sending the concept that that's what you need to do because this is the honorable thing to do, or you need to revenge for humiliation for this or for that, and so on and so forth. It always has to do with honor and humiliation. What is needed to be developed is the counter-narrative to this honorable thing to do. Now, who can do that? Does Matt can do it? Does Bruce? Me? No. The only one who really can counter the narrative of the honorable thing to do and say this is not the honorable thing to do are the Muslims themselves. And we need to find a way to make it clear to them that they are not doing any favors to us, non-Muslims, by conveying this message that this is not the honorable thing to do. This is not what your culture, your religion is expecting you to do. It should come from the Muslim community itself. If it won't come from there, we are all, I don't want to use the term which is needed to describe that, we are all in big trouble here.
All right. In the back, please.
I think it's on. Is it on?
There you go.
Wonderful. Herbert Tinsley with the START Consortium up at the University of Maryland. So it's typical for these conversations to adhere to what we might call a strictly sort of socio-political lens, but then we're talking about individuals, so there's definitely a psychological angle to this. I think there's some significant evidence that idiosyncratic objectives become strongly aligned with the objectives of terrorist organizations. Think of Omar Mateen specifically in this case. I wonder if you would would comment at all on how important you think it is to understand the idiosyncratic dimension and whether or not there's a role for public health to play when it comes to these counter-messaging issues.
I would like to state for the record that I did not plant that question, but it having been asked, I will take the opportunity to say that yes, at the Washington Institute, we recently did a bipartisan study on countering violent extremism focused here in the United States. The first one we've done focused specifically in the United States. We've done several others on CVE internationally writ large. And one of our bipartisan findings was that it's important to have a public health style model that will think about this in a much broader way, not to the exclusion of law enforcement, to the contrary, in tandem with strong connective tissue to law enforcement, because there is such a personal, psychological grievance piece of this that is driving people. That's not all it is. There's ideology. I've never seen a case, my work in or out of government, that was either grievances or ideology. And almost every case is going to be some different combination, which is why Boaz's point is so important, that we do lack understanding enough. I would say we're beginning to have some understanding. The most important understanding we could have is that every single case will be different. We can find the things that we can expect to see, and then we can figure out the proportions of each for each particular case. But because many people, including Omar Mateen, are going to be very confused people. This is someone, in terms of his Islamist orientation, at one point described himself as Islamic State, and another point as Al-Qaeda, another point as Hezbollah, not understanding the differences between them, probably not understanding that they are literally fighting each other tooth and nail back in the Middle East. That wasn't the issue. To him, they were all groups that would enable him to do something honorable and remove humiliation. And therefore, it is critically important to be able to address both the socio-political and the psychological, the environmental and the global issue and the local grievance as well. And any CVE process, I'd argue here or elsewhere, that's going to be effective is going to have to be able to address all of those. The public health model would try and do things at a societal level that would make society strong. And then when you find a place that seems susceptible, a neighborhood or a school, a port of entry, you do extra things there. And then when you find people who are actually being affected by the message, you go in and you start doing things specifically for that, as if individual who's gotten sick, to use the public health model. We go into it in detail there. You can find it on our website. But I think it's critically important. Again, not because public health is now instead of counterterrorism or instead of law enforcement or intelligence, but it's in tandem. And the best example I can give you is the one you gave, Omar Mateen. Go ask the FBI and others, and they will tell you how frustrating it is to have investigated Omar Mateen and many other cases, including 4 big ones in the United States where things did happen, and having run those investigations to ground, realized there was nothing to hold these people on, nothing to convict them of. Strange, obnoxious, even disturbing speech is protected in this country and should be. And yet there was no one to hand this person off to. There was no local network of, say, clinical social workers and psychologists that say, look, this person has clearly got some disturbing attributes going on. And then it became arrest or nothing. And that can't be the options. And so, ironically, for those who think that the public health model is weak, and when you have a counterterrorism problem, you invite in law enforcement, it's law enforcement that's saying, please help me. Because there's not always going to be a law enforcement solution, much like internationally, there won't always be a military solution to these counterterrorism problems.
I want to jump in just in order to pave the way for Bruce to answer the question. I want to tell you, first of all, I think that your question is a very important question. The fact that this propaganda is being sent to so many people altogether, but only few are alluded to the messages is a proof that you are right. That psychological aspect is true. I refer to myself as a student of Bruce, therefore I don't want to take any of his time, and anybody who's reading his magnificent book, Inside Terrorism, would understand how important this fact is, so I actually hand it over to Bruce.
Yeah.
Well, I'm tempted to actually quote another of our colleagues, Brian Jenkins, who said, when we can look within the soul of a person, then we'll understand if he's going to become a terrorist or not. I mean, that's one of the main challenges, is I don't think there is any profile. And it's even more challenging now because of social media introducing so many different types, some who are clearly mentally imbalanced and who could be spotted, but others who don't.
Yeah, and that was definitely the case in data that Marlene was looking at too. But Bruce, since you're too humble, I will take the opportunity to plug the latest edition of Inside Terrorism. If you're interested in these things and you truly want to understand, you will not take it out of the library. You'll buy it and then read it. Can we have a mic right over here, please?
Hi, I'm Samantha Mandalese with Americans for Peace and Tolerance. Thank you for joining us. And I'm interested a little bit in the nitty-gritty of the distribution of messaging, especially in reference to Marlene Mazel's study. I'm curious as to whether you had any sense during conducting your study of the mechanisms of distribution. You mentioned that there were flyers, pro-Shaheed flyers, and state funerals, as well as financial incentives. And I'm wondering, did you find that there are certain locations that have different concentrations of each type of encouragement? And did you find that there are certain population centers, certain geological features that contribute to where the different types of messaging go, and perhaps how many or what type of people they affect?
You know, it's an interesting question, because I was just thinking about that angle of distribution this week, because I was looking at the connection on the psychological perspective as it relates to suicides. Because I was interviewing an expert here in Washington, and they were explaining, I was trying to understand what official glorification, like why would that perhaps be more egregious than other kinds of glorification, and they were explaining when there's an act like a suicide here in Maryland, and they created a whole suicide prevention program, they tried to prevent any kind of official ceremonies, official acts. And then in the studies that I was reading, they say that when they're trying to do analysis on suicide prevention, they talk about spheres of influence, like how much information then reaches out to how many circles and how many people actually then get influenced. So the study hasn't yet gone to that level of resolution. In the funerals, it's simple. I mean, the funerals you can see easily in the pictures. They're attended by thousands and thousands of people. On the flyers, exactly, you know, beside how many hits there are on the websites that are looking at the flyers, we haven't reached that level of resolution. But it's very clear that the information is widely distributed, and the understanding of the youth that just from an instinctive basis, right? You're a child, you go to a funeral of a friend, and it's an official funeral that's being, with all the bells and whistles of every kind of honor that can be given, that reaches thousands very clearly. And then from the context of what could that do in the process of peace, for people who live in the region, you want to culture and educate children in both sides of the conflict to peace. And to the extent that you have glorification of terrorist acts and violence, that's an inconsistent message with messaging towards peace.
Thanks. Mike Kraft over here. Raise your hand, Mike. There you go.
Thanks very much for this interesting presentation. Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism writer, and for many years in the State Department Counterterrorism Office. Matt's discussion of the psychological aspect, and what this gentleman raised, reminds me of what Jessica Stern, an expert up in Harvard, once said, that many of the terrorists are trying to reinvent themselves. But there's another dimension, and I'd like to get your take on another aspect of the CVE effort. You talked a little bit about dealing with the internet and counter messaging. Wonder your evaluation of the effectiveness of this so far, but also the effort to reach out to local communities. I mean, DHS and FBI have programs that try to reach out to local communities here. The British and the Dutch have had various programs there. I think Bruce referred to resource issues, and it's my understanding DHS has cut back on their local grants. There's a story today in Foreign Policy that the State Department's efforts, the funding efforts, have been sitting on the 7th floor waiting to be approved. Do you have any evaluation so far of these efforts to date, and do you think they will have much chance of success?
I can say one thing about that, and maybe it's a little harsh position, I would say. There was a lot of effort being done in the recent years on CVE, led by Obama administration in the United States and with the Europeans. I do believe that CVE is important, it's crucial, and there is a need to bring the vast majority of the Muslims around the world, which are not radical, do not support those terrorist activists, to bring them to counter the narrative in an effective manner. It's their job. But the problem, in my view, is that those efforts, in most cases, was very apologetic, coming with a very cautious, maybe even fear, to deal with the problem itself. And I think it should be done differently. When you reach out to the Muslim communities, the message should be, God forbid, we have nothing against Islam like we have nothing against any other religion whatsoever. There is no problem with Islam, but there is a big problem in Islam right now, which represent a small minority, but a very dangerous minority. You know, I was in a panel with a Muslim imam, a religious cleric, and he said to a European crowd, how dare you refer to Islam as if it has something to do with terrorism? Islam is the religion of peace and clemency. Jihad is doing the good deeds and not those atrocities. When my turn was there, I approached him and I said, thank you from the bottom of my heart that you shared those important messages with us, and I'm not cynical. But why do you spend your time, your valuable time on us, non-Muslims? You should preach that every day to your believers, to your people in Sudan, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, telling those people which are beheading innocent civilians under the name of Islam, raising the flag of jihad, what they do is against Islamic concept and jihadi verdicts, not as a favor to us, Westerners, non-Muslim, in order to defend what you believe is Islam altogether. I think that's the message that needed to be given to the Muslim communities.
I'll just add that here in the United States, I think it's critically important that our CVE efforts be as granular as possible and as community-led as possible. The local police who are involved in community policing know their communities best. They're able to work at the most local, granular, comfortable level with people who are working in their communities, whether they're religious leaders or librarians or school teachers or what have you. The title of the CVE study we did is Defeating Ideologically Inspired Violent Extremism, a Strategy to Build Strong Communities and Protect the U.S. Homeland. And I will not lie to you, this is a bipartisan study, so yes, that was a heavily negotiated title. And I think that especially as there is ongoing debate and discussion about how and at what level the federal government should be involved in this space. We had these debates under the Obama administration with concerns about legal issues precluding federal government from getting involved in these issues to granularity. And currently we have ongoing debates with the Trump administration and how comfortable it is going to be in terms of dealing with different types of violent extremism. I think it's all the more important for this to be something that is state and local driven. And there's some excellent examples in Los Angeles, a very different model in Boston, in Minneapolis, and other parts of the country. And I think that's the last lesson, is that we should not be looking for one model that will work the same way in all parts of the United States, but rather state and local authorities should decide what works best for them. In Massachusetts, the State Office of Homeland Security is very involved with its state health and human services. And that is not the way it's working, say, in Los Angeles, where the mayor's office is working very closely with the local representative of the Federal Department of Homeland Security. And there's an entirely different model in Minneapolis and many other places. It has to be a model that works for them. And when you have that model working, you need to have involved religious leaders of whatever faiths are relevant, having that message, because as you've heard from now many of us, those of us in the context of radical Islamist extremism, those of us who are not Muslims are not credible messengers on this issue. We have a mic up here for Sarah, right up front. And this will be our last question.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was really, really excellent from all of you. My question is for all of you, but particularly in light of what you said, Boaz, I think it's extremely important that we encourage these moderate voices within Islam. Not only moderate, but these are actually reformers within Islam. And I have gotten to know a lot of them very personally. People like Noni Darwish, Wafa Sultan, Judy Zasser, the son of Hamas, Mossab Hussein Yosef, who calls me his mother, his Jewish mother. Anyway, but the thing is, it is extraordinarily frightening for them. They're all in hiding. how do we encourage them when they know that there are fatwas against all of them? Thanks.
I think that maybe Bruce would answer that.
Well, I mean, I have a slightly different view on the CVE. I think as uneven as the progress has been made, we're already facing a new challenge because the Islamic State used to say, come help us build a state. Now they're saying, come and exact revenge. And as challenging as it's been to frame a message to the people that have answered, on much more ideological or even theological bases, you're talking about probably the most visceral emotion known to man, which is the emotion of revenge and retaliation. And I think the challenge that we're going to see is how do you frame a message that has more to do with Frantz Fanon and the wretched of the earth, the catharsis of violence, the empowerment of violence, the fact that violence is good and feels good. How do we counter that message? And certainly the moderate voices are going to be enormously important, but it also means we have to think differently of how we address a changing message from the terrorist organizations.
Absolutely. We could go on for a long time, but I know everybody has busy schedules. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for taking the time today. Thank you very much. Live for a couple of minutes, so thank you all. That's great.
Enjoyed it very much.